Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Cozier. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Human Rights Campaign. I am thrilled to be able to be part of this program today, so much so that I postponed my vacation to make sure I was able to join it. This program and this content speaks to me on so many levels, and I'm particularly thrilled to be able to bring this program to you in partnership with the NAACP. So 100 years ago today, August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. This celebration is really complex for me as a woman of color, as an immigrant, as a lesbian, and my guess is that for our panelists and guests as well, because the women's suffrage movement is riddled with the erasure of women of color. First, the 19th Amendment didn't guarantee the right to vote for all women. In fact, the actual amendment declared only that states could not discriminate in voting based on sex. It didn't guarantee anything. But even after the passage of the 19th Amendment, millions of women of color were still barred from the polls. In Puerto Rico, which as a territory was not covered by the 19th Amendment, women continued to face enfranchisement discrimination on the basis of sex until 1935. Native American and Asian immigrants were largely excluded from citizenship entirely up until 1948 and 1943, respectively. And most Black women in the South, like Black men who in theory were enfranchised by the 15th Amendment, were blocked by poll taxes, literacy tests, and other racial barriers until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's a long way from 1920. Now, not only did the benefits of enfranchisement not apply to women of color, the incredible contributions of women of color leaders within the suffrage movement have all but been rendered invisible. Despite the critical contributions of Black, Indigenous, Asian, immigrant, and Latinx people, our history books often whitewash the champions of suffrage and the racism and exclusion that was inherent in the movement. And unfortunately, that same erasure and exclusion of the political contributions of women of color have been repeated time and again throughout our history. Yet, we also know that the power of women of color has also been pivotal time and time again in our political process. And it absolutely will be crucial in the path to taking back the White House, the Senate, and retaining the House in the upcoming 2020 elections. That's why this conversation is so important. And I don't think it is a coincidence that we have a convergence of the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment and a reckoning around racial injustice with the most crucial presidential election of our lifetimes. Today, we have a powerhouse slate of guests to help shed critical light on the too long denied contribution of women of color in our history and how we ensure that we change the narrative, reclaim our visibility if we want to win back the soul of our country. So to kick off this conversation, I am really excited to be joined by Congresswoman Gwen Moore of Wisconsin. Hello, Congresswoman. While we're waiting for the Congresswoman, I will just share a little bit about her. Congresswoman Moore has been a trailblazer throughout her career. She was the first Black woman to be elected to the Wisconsin State Senate in 1993, and the first Black member of Congress. I'm sorry, we have a change in lineup. We're blessed with two great Congresspeople this morning, and we're going to be hearing first from Congresswoman Judy Chu. So let me shift gears and welcome Congresswoman Judy Chu. Welcome so much. So we have the privilege of being joined by Congresswoman Judy Chu of California. So let me do your introduction. Congresswoman Chu has been a strong leader in the House on behalf of her Southern California district and people around the country since her election in 2009. Congresswoman Chu has been a leader on civil rights, including voting rights, racial and ethnic profiling, and bullying and hazing in the armed forces. She has been a strong voice for immigrants and immigration reform. And the LGBTQ community has always been able to count on her to fight for us, from the repeal of the discriminatory Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to ensuring same-sex marriage couples were not penalized by the Defense of Marriage Act. Now she is a strong proponent of the Equality Act. Please welcome Congresswoman Judy Chu.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole. Yes, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu. So honored to be here on the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote at this historic convention. But for those 100 years, for far too long, women of color have been seen but not heard, invisible in a society that has underestimated them. They are people like Hilda Solis, who in high school was thinking about going to college when her guidance counselor told her not to do it because she wasn't college material and suggested that she become a secretary. Well, thank goodness, a different counselor, Mr. Sanchez, encouraged her to go to college. Most importantly, he advised her not to listen to people who doubted her abilities or discouraged her dreams. Hilda did get her college degree, then got elected to Congress, and then did become a secretary. She actually became the first Latina to be appointed to the cabinet as a secretary of labor. Well, that advice from Mr. Sanchez ultimately benefited me. Growing up, I never thought I would be an elected official because I never saw anyone who looked like me in government. When I finally did run for the California State Assembly, I was told it was not my time and was blocked by the Old Boys Network. Things looked bleak, but then somebody came to help me. It was Hilda Solis. She knew what it was like to go against the Old Boys Network herself and extended her hand. Her support was what I needed to win that seat and then my seat in Congress. Because of that, I became the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress in history. So mountains are moving, and it is because women are saying not only yes, we can, but yes, we must. Following the election in 2016, it was women fed up with the bigotry, the division, and the attacks on our rights that filled the streets in cities across the country to make our voices heard. And what happened? In 2018, we elected more women and people of color than ever before, leading to a Congress that looks more like America. It's a long time coming. The women of color have been in this country since its founding 244 years ago. It is in the last 5 years that women of color have made some major breakthroughs. Today in Congress, we have the first Native American women, the first Muslim American women, the first South Asian woman, and the first Vietnamese American woman. Today, women of color in Congress hold powerful positions, such as Maxine Waters, the first and only woman of color to chair the Congressional Financial Services Committee, and Nydia Velázquez, the first and only woman of color to chair the Congressional Small Business Committee. Finally, we have a Congress that is recognizing the talents of women of color, and America is the better for it. And now we have a presidential ticket that looks like America too. And that is why I'm so excited that when we nominate not only a proven leader like Joe Biden, but also when we make history by nominating the first Black woman and the first Asian American for Vice President, Kamala Harris. As Kamala breaks through that highest of glass ceilings, what excites me are the millions of young girls that her candidacy will inspire, leading them to pursue dreams that they never otherwise would have imagined for themselves. We are being told that it's not our turn, and we're done with it. We are done with being told we are too ambitious. Our voices matter. Our experiences matter. Together, we can lift up all Americans. Together, we can fight the discrimination and bigotry that sidelined us. And together, we can elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and tell the next generation of girls, this is our time.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Chu. This is our time, and we have to do this together. Thank you so much for taking time out to be with us. Now, I wanted to switch to our panel. We have an incredible panel of brilliant minds in the political and movement building space with us this afternoon. It would take me the better part of this week to share all of their accomplishments, so I encourage you to read their bios. But I just want to say a couple of things about each one as they come on. Mia Aragin is a visual storyteller, a digital and communications director, and a seasoned campaign strategist whose approach to leadership and commitment to progressive coalition building, which was forged through her own experiences as a queer, brown, immigrant woman in the rural South. Mia has done the work of disruption both inside and outside the halls of power, understanding that we have the power to transform our world when we can step up and claim it. Mia is now applying her passions and experience in team building, authentic storytelling, and social advocacy as Mi Gente's Director of Strategic Communications. Welcome, Mia. Karen Boykin-Towns has built a reputation as a visionary and strategic results driver in complex business and government environments based on demonstrated success in the areas of policy, advocacy, communications, and proactive change management. She was recently re-elected vice chairman of the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, NAACP, Board of Directors. Congratulations. And the NAACP, as we know, is the oldest and largest nonpartisan civil rights organization in the nation, established in 1909. Karen leverages her talents as a coalition builder and social change agent through her active participation in various organizations. Wakenya Clanton, a Canton, Mississippi native, serves as a senior advisor to DNC chairman Tom Perez. She is the architect of the party's premier organizing program for Black women, Seat at the Table, and was one of the party's most sought out political engagement strategists after the party's historic victories in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Alabama in 2017. She's a graduate of Tougaloo College, equity advisor for the international beauty brand Sephora, and National Social Action Commissioner for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Welcome, Wakenya. Myra Macias is a highly sought after organizer, educator, and political operative. Myra was named one of the American Association of Political Consultants top 2019 40 under 40. She joined the Latino Victory Project in 2017, serving as a national political director and vice president. And Myra was the architect behind Latino Victory's 74% win rate in the 2018 cycle, playing a critical role in electing the most diverse congressional class in history. Thank you for that, Myra. Myra is the current executive director of the Latino Victory Fund. Ense Ufat has dedicated her life and career working on various civil, human, and workers' rights issues. As the chief executive officer of the New Georgia Project, she is proud to lead the organization in its goal of strengthening the state's democracy and overseeing NGP's efforts to expand the voting power and political influence of Black, Asian, and Latinx people by registering each of the 800,000 unregistered voters of color across the state. The success of this work is a political feat, and it makes a solid case for the impact of arts and cultural organizing in movement building. Welcome to you all. I am so in awe and just honored to be on the panel with you. Thank you for being here, and I know these remarks are an inadequate reflection of who you are, but I know we are all eager to start our conversation. And I really would like this to be a conversation. So I invite you to jump in as the questions move you, while of course making sure that we have space for all of us to engage. So let's get to it. Now, we know that our history is littered with examples where movements have sacrificed people at the intersections of multiple struggles for liberation. Yet those very movements could not have advanced without the vital contributions of those same folks who were often left behind. The women's suffrage movement was no different. So the first thing I want to do is anchor this conversation in a more accurate reflection of the women's suffrage movement and the diversity of the players that were really central to it. So Karen, I'm going to ask you the first question here. What role did women of color play within the women's suffrage movement?
Well, Nicole, first off, thanks to the Human Rights Campaign and the NAACP for partnering and having us all here. This is an amazing panel of women. But what I would say is that despite what many of us, me included, learned in school, women of color were very much involved in the women's suffrage movement. Certainly, although there are few people other than maybe scholars and activists who knows the names of the scores of women, especially African American women who participated on all levels of the modern like Black freedom movement, you know, in terms that we know now as leaders, grassroots activists, strategists, and theorists. But the fact of the matter is that oftentimes the African American women who were involved were at odds with their white counterparts in some of the mainstream organizations. And they continue to use their church communities as an organizing base to develop ideas around women's rights. And through that club movement, it helped African American women to see each other as political beings and became sort of a foundation in how they worked. So in cities like Chicago, African American women embraced party politics and aligned themselves with party operatives to be real players. They used, you know, their influence and ability to vote at the state level, even before 1920, to affect the question of women's suffrage nationally. And so, you know, as we now hear more of these stories come to light, it's really incredible to see that even then we were at the table and moving things forward, finding a way to lead.
Thank you, Karen. So true. Anybody else want to share or chime in on this question?
Yeah, this is Wakenya. Thank you, Nicole, for this amazing forum, and thank you to the Human Rights Campaign and the NAACP for pulling together such a vital conversation. I think to just echo Vice Chairwoman Karen Borkentown's remarks, you know, when I think about, you know, when you talk about giving credit to where credit is due, you can't talk about the women's suffrage movement without talking about the Black abolitionist movement. So when you talk about that, you're talking about women, you're introduced to women like Sojourner Truth, who gave the infamous "Ain't I a Woman" talk, right? And her speech actually transformed the way that we saw ourselves as a part of this movement. And when you think about the suffrage movement and just how that whole process came to be and how, you know, Black women had led us to this moment, and then that moment was taken away from us, right? We were actually bargained out of our own labor at that time. You know, you can't help but really want to take the opportunity to elevate the fact that, you know, despite having those conflicts, we still showed up. We still showed up, and we showed up as we always do, because it wasn't about the publicity, it was about the purpose. And our purpose in that moment was to not be written out of history. In that moment, when I think about women like Mary Church Terrell and, you know, and my fabulous founders of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, who made sure that we were there and we were seen and we were a part of that movement, because we realized what that meant, what that representation meant for all of us, those of us who were laboring in states who weren't, you know, at the liberty to walk away and come and be a part of that march. It really took, and that's what it really means to have a seat at the table. Really, when you're in a position to represent others in your cause, you should always leverage that and do that. And so I'm so grateful for the women who were courageous enough to not be dismayed by being almost erased from the conversation.
Yeah.
And if I may, Nicole, I just want to echo what Kenya said about history and being erased from the history books, because I actually have never really felt connected to the women's suffrage movement, in part because in my mind, it's a very white movement, right? Women of color didn't get the right to vote when the 19th Amendment was ratified. And so it was actually in doing some pre-work for this conversation that I realized how many Latinas were actually part of this movement, and yet we don't know about them. And so much of the work that we have to do now is helping uplift these women that were part of history and who have deliberately been written out of it. Because frankly, you know, this, like I see and loved when the women of Congress all wore white in honor of this movement, but this movement has not felt like my movement because I had not heard the stories of the women that looked like me who were fighting in this movement. And I want to just uplift one woman that, again, in preparation for this panel, I found out about. And, you know, it's a disgrace that in my 30 plus years of life, I'd never heard of this woman. And this is some, you know, I'm in politics. This is the work that I do. And if I have not heard of this person, I don't expect young Black and brown girls to have known about this person either. And so much of the work that we have to do is making sure that we're uplifting these stories. And so I discovered that this Latina in New Mexico named Nina Otero Warren was actually one of the heads of the women's movement in New Mexico, because New Mexico was one of the states where Latinos were a majority of the population, where Spanish was spoken. And she was key in ratifying the 19th Amendment in New Mexico, which again was a critical state in order for it to have been ratified nationally. And I say all this, one, to uplift her name. She was the first Latina to run for Congress in 1922, but also because I'm going to be more deliberate about searching for these women, searching for these names, like, and making sure that the younger generation feels like this is also their movement. Because sometimes that apathy that we have around voting is because we don't realize the labor and the sacrifice that has been done on behalf of our communities in order to make sure that we have these rights now.
And that's such a good point, Mara, because when I think about the fact that what happened in 1920 also happened in 2017, after, you know, history decided to rewrite itself. And we saw the election of Donald Trump, and then you saw this outpouring of support from women across the country, white women really getting together saying, hey, we got to go out here and protest this guy, right? You didn't protest him at the ballot, but you wanted to protest him on the mall and watch it, whatever, it's fine. But I think about Tamika Mallory and Lisa Soar and Carmen and so many others who said, no, we are also women. Ain't I a woman too? You know, and they carried that spirit of sojourner truth into that movement. And you saw how it drastically changed just by the voices of women of color being elevated in that form, and women of color feeling empowered and emboldened by the fact that we will be heard and we will be included. I just wanted to put shine a little light on that too, because it's not, we talk about it like 1920 was, you know, a long time ago, but no, we can look at 2017 and still see some remnants of that same behavior play itself out. But then you also see where black and brown women say, no, not today, you know? So I really appreciate you bringing that to light as well. And also it just brought to my remembrance of what happened with them in 2017.
But let's just take a step forward though, in terms of how things went with that, right? Mm-hmm. You know, Tamika is a good friend of all of ours, but to see how they had to struggle within as they had to fight for intersectionality, and then, you know, how it all ended. And truth be told, I don't know who leads the Women's March right now, but what I do know is that Tamika Mallory and the crew are, you know, in, you know, Kentucky right now, right, with Until Freedom, doing the work and, you know, showing up despite. So it's interesting how history continues to repeat itself in different ways. But here we are.
Yeah.
And thank you for opening up that conversation around intersectionality, Karen, because, you know, talk about history repeating itself. In what is a now famous speech in 1866, so poet, novelist, and suffragist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper told an audience that the fates of Black and white, rich and poor were all bound up together. And she refused to decouple race from gender, arguing that the day-to-day racism she and other Black women were experiencing was in fact a women's issue, and that suffragists were obligated to confront it. And this is the concept that we know, you know, more than a century later, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw as intersectionality. But it was playing out in a very real way throughout our history. And so we've seen that sort of repeat itself over. And so I'd love to build more on what Karen just talked about, and about how we see this intersectionality playing out historically and in our political landscape, both positively and negatively. For women of color. And say, did you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, I mean, historically, when I think about, intersectionality, it's the idea that we carry multiple identities and that none of us have the benefit of being able to drop our identity. So when living in a world or living in a country or a context where, you have multiple identities that are subject to oppression, that can have an policy, et cetera, really comes to mind is the fight for the right to vote, right? For suffragists. We released a video today talking about sort of the work to sort of be seen and taken seriously within one's gender, and then also to sort of advocate for yourself within one's gender. Of Delta
And
Sigma Theta, tons of women of color. Am I breaking up?
you're breaking up a little bit.
I was
Yes.
We missed the Delta
I'm
part.
breaking up. Okay.
Just rewind 15 seconds and restart.
Yeah. I'm just going to flag that the founders of Delta Sigma Theta and many of the women of color who marched and organized in the late 1800s, early 1900s, were marching and organizing and lobbying and suing for rights that they would not enjoy for another 45 years, right? In the case of Black women, and in another 55 years in the case of language people voting and citizens with language who are language minorities. And so, thinking about intersectionality, thinking about, again, how if we keep it a buck, that it was the 15th Amendment that was supposed to have given Black men the right to vote, the idea that, no citizen should be denied the right to vote, regardless of, whether or not they've been, subject to the inhumane and dehumanizing practice of chattel slavery. And so, again, the idea of working to advance the causes of one's race and ethnicity, as well as working to, again, advocate for oneself as a part of a particular gender or gender identity is, I think, something that has played out in pursuit of the right to vote. I think in pursuit of reproductive health and sort of reproductive justice, in pursuit of economic sort of stability and economic justice. I think that there are very much, we just celebrated, was it Black Women's Equal Pay Day last week? So that is the point in the year where the Black woman an average Black woman makes what a white guy made the previous year. We're in August, right? So thinking about, and so, I think Latina equal pay day, Black women equals pay day. I think that these are all opportunities to sort of highlight the negative impact or the organizing that's happening to mute the negative impact of, racism and sexism. Because again, it's not our race or our gender that make us vulnerable or that make us put us at risk. It is these sort of unhealthy, sort of misogynist practices. It's these racist practices and white supremacist practices in our society. There's absolutely nothing wrong with our gender. There's absolutely nothing wrong with our race and ethnicity, right? And it is how we are treated and how we are received and how we are seen in a particularly unhealthy society. And so I say that, and not to completely focus on the negative, but carrying those multiple identities, recognizing that there's nothing that one can do to drop their identity, showing up fully as your whole self, like not to, heavily rely on retreat language, but showing up fully as yourself, has led to significant advances on behalf of all of us. So again, women of color, Black women organizing, around something that was right and that was just, even when they knew that they weren't going to be able to immediately benefit from it themselves. I think that's our history, that's our legacy, that's where we come from, that is what we're building on top of.
Yep.
Absolutely. And so much of that also is about visibility and who has the political power to actually orchestrate change, legislation. Changing hearts and minds is something we talk about very much in our work in HRC. And so as we think about that, I wanted to shift gears a little bit to the present, because we are literally barreling towards the most important election of our lifetimes. And I both can't wait, and I am also terrified at the same time. And so, when we think about people engaging and investing in a process that they may not see benefit themselves at some point, I think very much about the political power of Black women and women of color. And we hear that Black women are the bedrock of the Democratic Party and are loyal even when they don't see themselves represented in that. And I think we can say the same for Latina and API women as well. And we also know that Black women and Latina women are, and like white women, vote at higher rates than their male counterparts. So when you think about this incredible block of voters and this voting power, do you think that candidates are sufficiently considering that power, particularly for women of color vote, when they are developing their outreach strategies? And also, just kind of as a follow-up question, who have you seen do this well? And I'd love to invite Mia and to kick us off on this one.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just take a step further back to name more specifically the problem, which is that we frequently see this framed as women, Black, Indigenous, people of color are not turning out to vote. And I think, how do we convince them to turn out? How do we get them to engage? But to act like we have something to teach people who didn't vote or who don't vote misunderstands the problem fundamentally. Not voting is a choice. And so really the question is, what are we doing to earn votes and to earn trust? How are we investing in communities and in the solutions that we need? And part of how we do this is in that outreach. Part of how we do this as campaigns is that external outreach, but also it has a lot to do with what campaigns look like. And our campaigns need to reflect the people that we're working for. So frequently this gets relegated to having a diverse field team, right, who's going to be knocking on doors. But whether you're fundraising, whether you're doing voter outreach, whether we're telling stories or engaging community, to do our jobs well, we have to know our own stories and we have to know the stories of these communities. And so campaign representation is good outreach strategies include hiring from within those communities. And then on the internal piece, campaign representation and diversity and having a strong campaign team isn't just about race and gender and ethnicity, it's also about geographic diversity. And again, tying that back to bringing in from the community. So we know that this works. We saw Senator Sanders do it in the primaries and turn out Latinx people because he was hiring organizers who've been organizing their communities for decades. We, in 2018, on the Abrams campaign, we saw that all this at play again. Our senior staff was primarily Georgia women of color, Black women led. Our campaign looked like Georgia, and we built this homegrown team that challenged the way that we had built campaigns in the past. And the last thing that I will say is that we cannot let this outreach be just the work of campaigns, because we're building long-term infrastructure, and women of color know this, and we've been doing this. We've always built for the future. And we see organizations like New Georgia Project, like Working Families Project, like SONG, Southerners on New Ground, like Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights in Georgia, doing this work now. It's baking in the electoral organizing, but it doesn't end in November, and we have to invest in the long term.
Yeah, I just want to echo Mia there on so many points, because I approach it from the party standpoint. So when I came into the building in 2017, we had a big culture problem. We had a big culture problem with communities because there was a feeling amongst our voters that we only addressed them as voters, right? We didn't see the humanity behind their vote. We didn't recognize the various social economic challenges that they were facing. And so anytime that folks were engaging them, they were only talking to them around election time. Mm-hmm. And so when I came into the party, I actually came in as the director of African American and women's outreach and engagement for the party. So that's basically the whole party. Okay, women represented the party, Black people about another third of that. That's I got everybody. And a big part, a big part of my task was actually figuring out how do we penetrate, right? What is missing here? And, I tell people all the time, there are two types of people that work in politics. You got social scientists and political scientists, okay? I'm a social scientist. So I always approach my organizing from a relational standpoint. And that could come, Karen, from my many years with the NAACP. That's where I got my rearing. But they teach us community first, right? Mm-hmm. You cannot do this work without focusing on people. And it's about the narrative. It's about the story and making sure that people can see themselves in the politics that you're presenting to them. Right. And so we created a couple of programs during that time. We created Seat at the Table, which was our Black women's engagement program, which I was so happy to lead. It was like, this is my sweet spot. I got Black and women. Oh, I'm in there. Right. And then we also created Mujeres Mobilize, which was designed specifically for Latinx women. Right. We wanted to make sure that we had an inclusive arm because we recognize the parallels that run with both of those communities. You can't talk about health, wealth, responsibility without talking about Black and brown women. And so really running those programs parallel to each other. My colleague, Cynthia Rothono, she amazing. Cynthia took that up and she really did. And she went into the communities in the Brown Belt and really was hyper focused on making sure that we were engaging Latinas during the 2018 election cycle. And you saw the remnants of that. You saw the coupling of Black and brown women engagement and how that helped us flip the House in 2018. But that was because we decided to do organizing in both culture and in language at the DC, which was a completely different overhaul. I don't know that we had been doing it before. It was heavily driven by data, right? Data points, data sets. And it's like, well, polls are cool. That helps you figure out what your message should be. It doesn't help you figure out what your approach should be. And so we had to really clean our lens when it came to that, and we saw the results of that. And I think that's how we kind of started setting a model for our state parties to even start doing that type of work. Mia mentioned that it can't just be on these campaigns to do this work. It is a 365 approach that we have to have with this, and that starts with the infrastructure. So making sure that state party apparatuses are also bought in to the idea of organizing in both culture and in language, so that when we talk about intersectionality and we talk about inclusivity, we're not just talking about the color of our skins, we're talking about our thought, our geography, we're talking about our lived experiences, and all of that stuff plays into how we reach and engage voters in this election cycle.
I want to add just another layer of nuance to what both Mia and what Kenya said, because and I love that phrase, organizing in culture, because I think that is spot on. Thinking about candidates. And so at Latino Victory, our goal is to build Latino political power through more Latinx progressive candidates. Mm-hmm. The reason why these candidates do well with their constituency or their voters is because they know the community, to Mia's point, right? Like the $1 million question that we get cycle after cycle is, how do you turn out Latino voters? And the bottom line is you need to ask for our vote. Yeah. And shocking, not a lot of campaigns do it. This Latino Decisions election eve poll showed that in 2018, over 40% of Latinos who were surveyed said that no campaign or no party or candidate had reached out to them asking for their vote. And you know who asked for their vote? The folks, the local elected officials who are in the community, who know where folks gather, who know where and how to talk to folks who aren't typically engaged. And so we need to take, as a party, as a movement, take the lead, or rather we need to let these local leaders lead and take their direction on how to do this movement work, how to do this organizing work, because the people that best know their communities are those that are on the ground doing the thankless and silent work day in and day out, right? Like I'm here as part of a national organization, and the work that we do is only possible because there are local organizations on the ground organizing year round, helping build the infrastructure so that when we are helping support candidates, there's already something in place to support these Latinx candidates. But this can't happen without those folks that are doing that laborious work year round. And I think, all of us do a great job of uplifting them, but as a collective, they need a lot more love and a lot more resources.
Yeah. I will just add very quickly that what they have described can simply just be described as campaign malpractice, right? That if you ignore the culture and the people, if you've ignored the culture, you've ignored the people, and you've also ignored a mountain of data and evidence to support the idea of who makes up your base and what it is that they care about. So you have these hard numbers on the side. So you're ignoring the math and you're ignoring the people. How is that a winning strategy? How does that form a winning strategy? I would argue that, the candidates that are going to survive sort of these attacks on our democracy, these attacks on American institutions, aggressive voter suppression, the candidates that are going to survive, that are going to leap over that and sort of build the party of the future are candidates that, again, not only are data informed, not data driven, right? Data informed, going back to what Kenya said, that it is about the people, right? And it is about talking and listening to people. They will tell you what their priorities are. When you are clear about who your base is, and then you super serve your base, they are loyal, they show up, they see their fortunes tied with yours and the success of your campaign. And people are invested in ways that will bear fruit that you can't even imagine, right? This is how and why, despite all evidence to the contrary, Trump's base believes that he is the best choice for them and their agenda and their country. They have a champion in him. And so who are our champions, right? And who are the people that are going to ride for us as we ride for them, as we figure out how to build this America of our future?
And that's a great segue and say, because we've been talking a lot about women as voters, but I don't want to leave this conversation without also talking about women as political candidates, women in critical staffing positions. Patsy Mink became the first woman of color and the first Asian American woman elected to Congress in 1964. And then Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman elected to the United States Congress in 1968. Yet in 2020, women of color are about 20% of the US population, yet we're only 9% of the total members of Congress, 4.5% of statewide elective executives, and 7.4% of state legislators. So there's a real gap between the power of our vote, the presence in our communities, and how we're showing up at these highest offices to be able to champion change. So, yet we've been hearing a lot from campaigns around the importance of diversity. So when we think about that, and we think about Kamala Harris now being named as Biden's running mate, do you think that will have an impact on representation of women of color in Congress? If so, how?
Well, Nicole, I think I'll take the first stab at that. A couple of things. One, diversity is significantly different than inclusion. So what you experience is you'll have a lot of people talking about, we have all these diverse hires, but hire them where? To hire them for what, right? So you can place people, you can give a person a job, but are you empowering them to do the job? That is the question. So yeah, it doesn't service you well when we get caught up in the narrative around just what diversity looks like, and we're not talking about inclusion. And inclusion means, case in point, I'm a Black, millennial, Southern woman, okay? And my perspective is completely different from most people who live inside my bubble, right? I approach things in a different way. Everyone wants to say, okay, we got 5 Black women on this team. That's it, right? But are you valuing the information, the insight, the perspective that are coming from these women? Same thing with, and I see it in I serve on a lot of different boards. I work with a lot of different organizations. And what I will tell you is that women of color have to do more to be heard, seen, and respected at tables than any other demographic out there. And a lot of times, sometimes the conflict that we experience come from people who look like us or who look similar to us, because everybody's fighting for the same slice, right? And that's just that same slice to be heard or to be valued. Everyone likes to have their point heard and then acted upon. But are we thinking thoroughly about how we use that information in other spaces? So that's the first part of the question. That wasn't really your question, but I wanted to put a little spice on that. I think the second part of what we want to talk about here is whether or not it is impactful to have Kamala Harris on a Biden ticket. My answer to that is absolutely. And I'll tell you why. At her announcement, we outraised any other campaign in political history. $48 million within, like, not even within 24 hours. So you see the impact. That means that's energy. That means people see themselves in ways that they haven't seen themselves before. That's a major thing. When people were talking about the narrative around her, the women in the race and being chosen and what it meant to have a woman of color rise as the running mate for Vice President Biden, it wasn't about what it meant to have a woman in that spot. It meant for Black women and brown women and Asian women and others, women of color, it meant the choice was made, right? We knew he had a decision to choose a woman, but he made a choice for a woman of color. And that, for Black women in particular, who have been breaking our backs since the beginning of time, even before there was a suffragette movement, to get inclusion, to fight for inclusivity for folks, that rung bells. There's a group of powerful women out here who have gotten together and rallied just to talk about what it really means to win with Black women. We talk about our votes all the time. That's like, and I think you are too. So, for us, it really is about the choice. It for the first time in a long time, we felt seen, right? We felt valued because we do what we, with Black women in particular, show up every election, not just because it's a right, but it's because it is a responsibility. We recognize what it means when we are not there. We recognize what's at stake. You don't have to give us no platform for us to know where you stand, okay? We are very practical people. We assess situations in real time, and we make decisions rapidly because that's what we have to do in our families every single day. When you have the responsibility of being a caretaker, when you have the responsibility of being a breadwinner, and everything, a teacher, a usher at the church, the pastor at the church, all of the things, you come to things with a different point of view. And what we do also recognize is that when we are at the table, every woman around us is also at that table. So what a Kamala Harris means for being VP, that means Wakenya can be VP. Wakenya can be president because Kamala made a way. That means the same thing for Myra and Mia and Stu and you, Nicole, and you too, Karen. It means that for all of us. For the first time in a long time, we talked about earlier in the beginning of this segment about the erasure of Black women and brown women in this movement. The decision that the vice president had to make, I do not envy. There were so many, all of those women were immensely qualified. Yeah. So not only as vice president, but as president. Some of them ran for president. Okay. And I think at the end of the day, we all had our various choices and picks and opinions about who should be there and who should leave. But we are grossly oversatisfied, I think, with the choice that we have. Because for the first time in a real time, we don't have to worry about whether or not we're going to be included in certain conversations. But I think we feel like we're already there. So I think when you ask me the question, will it have an impact? It already has. For little girls who stood at that screen and they looked up at it in admiration, like as a 30-plus-year-old woman, I looked at the screen. I heard it on the radio. I was coming from the hairdresser, I had to get the color touched up, and I heard it on the radio. And it meant something so different for me, and I felt a way that I didn't even expect to feel. I was preparing myself for whatever because I had to, because we have to be neutral. But when I got the news, there was a new fire lit inside of me, one that made me want to go out and rally and talk and raise money and do whatever I needed to do to ensure victory on November 3rd. Because what I realized is that victory isn't just for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. That victory is for all of us. For those of us who live unseen and invisible and unheard and unfelt and unrecognized every single day, that's what that victory will mean for us on November 3rd.
Yeah. Amen to that. Thank you so much,
I
Kenya.
have to really go to side I got to tell me her show.
And Karen, I saw you nodding vigorously. Did you want to add anything to that?
Well, first, I think I should first say that the NAACP is nonpartisan, but we are not non-political. And we understand what this all means. And I think for me, what I am overjoyed with is the fact that you see a coming together of women of all types. You see a coming together of organizations. It's like we understand that there is no time for there to be competition around amongst organizations and or getting caught up on petty grievances of who's included to speak or not. Like we all have to be on this, in this, because our lives depend on it, literally. And so I think this conversation and the Biden-Harris team, there is a lot that we are putting on it because there's a lot of damage that has happened. And I'm really, really pleased to see that since we've been on this call, it seems as though now the post office is going to step back from its cuts. Really? But when we fight, we win, right? And so we just have to nonstop to November. We have got to, on every front, be about it because, God only knows what our democracy would look like if we don't have the change that we need.
Absolutely. And that was a great segue because I was going to actually talk about, just as we are closing out, believe it or not, we are almost coming to the end of this hour. But it is really the fragility of our progress, right? In the last 3.5 years, and, I don't want to end on a down note, but I think that we have to have a sobering reality to keep us pushing through. So in the last 3.5 years, we have seen blatant attempts to roll back rights and civil liberties of the LGBTQ community, immigrant communities, reproductive health and rights, you name it. And voter suppression for people of color and trans and non-binary folks has been something heavy, I'm sure, on all of our minds and definitely for us at HRC as well. But all of the chaos and the machinations of this administration around the postal system as a tactic to disrupt our ability to vote safely during a global pandemic, right, is a very clear indication to me that the battle for suffrage is far from over. And we cannot take for granted for a second that these rights that we have achieved cannot be rolled back under the wrong leadership. So as we're drawing to a close, I want to ask all of you to weigh in on what you think we want to leave people with as we think about the battle ahead to take back the country, which is, this is not about an election. This is taking back the soul of our country. And so what do you think what do you want people to leave this conversation knowing and thinking about as we move forward to November 3rd?
So I'll just kick off and I'll just say that, Black women, women of color are the most consistent voting bloc there is. And our votes matter, and we will help decide who resides not just in the White House, but in every election down the ballot. And we must understand our power because others do, and we need to get that memo. There's only 77 days left. And we are all we got. There's no one coming to save us. We are all we got, and we have got to pull together in these days to really get not just to the finish line, but across the finish line so that we can then go about saving our democracy.
I'll jump in because I would be remiss for all my Florida people watching if I didn't mention that today is election day in Florida, the 1% state where literally it is the embodiment of every vote matters. And as we're heading into this election, it is not enough to make sure that you are registered to vote, to make a plan to vote. We have to go above and beyond and make sure that those around us are registered and have a plan, especially with so much skepticism around voting by mail. It's important that those of us that have the ability and access to information are helping mobilize our communities, our friends, our neighbors to make sure that they're getting the right information. Because regardless of whether or not, the post office is defunded or now, it's back to normal, the damage has been done, right? That skepticism, that fear has already been inserted into the narrative. And so it's going to take all of us to use our platform to push back, to make sure that people have the information that they need. And to steal Mia's line, it's not over on November 3rd. This work only begins after we get this man out of the White House, right? The work of accountability, of pushing for the progressive policies that we heard discussed on this presidential slate of candidates. And so registering to vote and voting is the bare minimum that you can do this election cycle.
And since you named Mia, why don't we pitch to Mia?
Sorry, Mia, I stole your line.
No, you're in my brain. I think that's right. And I think that what I would want us to remember is that this work is ongoing. And also that it is not just about casting a ballot. I'm a former undocumented person, and it's also not just about showing up and in the electoral space, but it is, like I said, about deep organizing, and it is about making it so that when those of us who can show up to vote, we're also bringing with us a whole community. And so, yes, and I think my call to action is invest now, and it can be wherever you are. It can be an hour. It can be a couple bucks. It can be a local campaign. There's a lot of local, really impressive local legislative races. There's state races. And we're all on the same team. We don't win or lose as individual states. We're winning and losing as a country. So investing now and holding on to that, because as Maida said, the work is just starting, and then come next year, it'll be accountability. It'll be pushing back and holding folks accountable.
Yep.
And say,
hey, I think the thought that I will leave you with is this: each of us needs a political home. I tend to subscribe to the gospel choir theory of organizing. The idea being that the reason that a gospel choir can hold a note for so long is that every individual vocalist is doing their part. So that when an individual is tired, or they have competing, professional or personal obligations, that the note will continue because people are doing their part. And so if we are going to defeat the enemies of progress, it's not going to be because of any individual's Herculean effort. It is, we are going to get on the other side because of each other, because we're accountable to one another. And I think that that's really important. So if your political home is the Human Rights Campaign or the NAACP or the DNC or your local party, find your people. The people who share your values, right? And who can't stand to see the same things happening, or who have a vision for the future and who are excited about it and who share your vision for the future. I think the other thing I would say, and then I will shut it down, is that this is real. What you are seeing is happening. The attacks on our infrastructure, the attacks on our democracy, all of this is happening. There isn't a tomorrow, right? Now is the time to figure out what you can do and what interventions you can make in order to, again, restore faith in our elections, make sure that we can stop the bleeding, stop the attacks on our community, stop the wasteful spending on priorities that don't align with our values. Now is the time. My understanding is that Democrats need 4 seats in order to gain control of the United States Senate, and 2 of them are in Georgia. We've talked a lot about the base. This is an opportunity. The difference between the successful candidate and the losing candidate in Georgia is going to be women. It's going to be Black, Indigenous, people of color. Right. Yep. And so now is the time to take our rhetoric, to close the gap between our rhetoric and how we actually invest and how we actually run campaigns.
Thank you. Well, Kenya, take us home.
Listen, folks, I'm going to shoot it to you straight, okay? On November the 3rd, there's one thing you need to know. Your civil liberties are on the ballot. I don't care who you like, how you feel. If you enjoy, the functionalities of being able to love who you love, if you enjoy the functionality of being able to go wherever you want to go and eat where you want to eat, all of those things are up on the ballot. Go to school where you want to go to school. All of that is up on the ballot. Courts are on the ballot. And so when you think about whether or not you want to participate in this process, right, actively participate in this process, I admonish you to think about the things that you currently enjoy and things you wish you could enjoy, right? Mm-hmm. This presidency, the one this administration we're currently under, it's not doing any of us any good. I think yesterday it was reported that we had lost 170,000 Americans to a global pandemic that we could have prevented had we just had leadership that was remotely compassionate enough to think about, or responsible, that's probably the better word, remotely responsible enough to think about their influence and how they have to be thoughtful about people who don't share, the same values. They think that they're invincible. Like, this pandemic literally infiltrate your body and take you down in matters of moments. And if we are not being vigilant with each other in that way, we're doomed. And I think we have to think about our participation in November the same way. I wouldn't even say just November. I'll say leading into November, because you got early vote days, you got vote by mail days, you have voter activations, National Voter Registration Day. We have so many days that we should be organizing around. And listen, I know sometimes it can be overwhelming to try to get introduced and affiliated with an organization. Do it on your own. We all have up to 10 to 20 text messages that we can send at one time. That's 10 to 20 people that you have reached from your cell phone, that are in your cell phone, who may have moved and haven't taken the time to re-register, or who may live in the state because and have to work a job that doesn't give them the flexibility that you enjoy. And so they may not have been able to participate in the last couple of elections, and therefore they have been purged, right? And need to be reminded that they need to re-register. Mm-hmm. Like, there's so many things that we can do. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and all the talk all day long. We should be using these opportunities to really talk to people in real time about why this is so important. I purposely chose to wear white today, right? Even though it took my people 55 years later to get the right to wear this white in this way, because I know we endeavored and we labored to get other people there. So sometimes your work ain't about you. Sometimes it's about the precedent that you're going to set so that it can be possible for other people like you, right? And I think we have a responsibility to that in this moment in particular. So I'm going to challenge everyone who is watching this streaming to share the fact that this is on all of us. It's irrespective of what party, no party, it don't matter. If you are a person living in this country, if you breathe air in this country, if you drink water in this country, know that this is your responsibility. Because just like I'm in Detroit, I'm coming to you live from Detroit today, and right down the road is Flint, Michigan.
That's right.
And we are almost approaching a decade in these United States of America where people have not had clean water to drink in the United States of America. That's atrocious. We're talking about I don't want to say concentration camps. We're talking about holding facilities in this country where babies, children are experiencing birthdays, if they can remember, still separated from their families under a pandemic. That's what we're dealing with in this country. And if we don't take it upon ourselves to change that, to be the authors of our own fate, we are doomed. We are doomed. There will be no more United States of America. There will be no more land of the free, home of the brave. This will no longer be the land of opportunity. If we do not do our part and ensure that every single person, I don't care if you know them or not, you need to ask them whether or not they have thought about whether they need to be registered to vote, whether or not they know their voter ID laws, whether or not they know where their polling place is, whether or not they know whether or not a post office box has been removed from their community, whether or not they know what their plan is to vote on election day. See if they need a ride. Send an Uber to pick up somebody. Send a Lyft to pick up somebody. There's so much you can do without doing a lot at all. So I encourage everyone who is watching this today to recognize that this is our fight. Suffrage for some of us is still not over. Victory has yet to be won, and we still have work to do.
Thank you, Wakenya. This was fantastic, and you all have done me the wonderful service of doing my closing remarks for me. So thank you. We had hoped to be joined by Congresswoman Gwen Moore, and we have been having technical difficulties, so we weren't able to have her join us as we had hoped. I thank her for her tenaciousness, because I know she's been trying very hard to be able to join us. And the lawnmower in the background is my hook. For being here today for such an invigorating and thoughtful conversation. It was absolutely worth coming back from vacation for. Special thank you to Congresswoman Judy Chu for taking time to be here. And look, we know and we've heard from the panelists what our call to action is, what our work is. We cannot be complacent. We cannot get distracted by the noise that will be thrown at us. And we cannot be deterred by the obstacles that we're likely to face. We have to use every asset at our disposal. And the good news is, as we've shown here, not just on this panel, but in the conversation we've had, that we have abundance of assets. We just have to draw on them. So thank you for joining us, everyone. Please vote. Please vote early. Vote with your friends and family. As Karen said, vote like our lives depend on it, because they do. Thank you. And here's to taking back our country on November 3rd.
All right.